they had a clause in there that after 5 years they could adjust the lease to raise the price. And I said, I really don't understand how you can do that. You have no inflation in China. I've always admired that about you. I mean, it's unique. Why are you violating your ideology like this? They took it out. So we got the building forever at the same rate. I'm Chaz Freeman. I spent much of my career dealing with China in one way or another. I was the interpreter for President Nixon's group in Beijing in 1972. And in 1973, I got to advance the opening of the U.S. Liaison office in Beijing. A little background here. The United States and China had no relationship at all, other than through Taipei, which we saw as the capital of China and vigorously defended as such internationally. But now we had suddenly an informal relationship with Beijing, Taipei's rival. The question was, how do we manage that? Nixon had opened the door, but we were concerned there might be a political upheaval, a succession crisis. Ironically, it turned out to be on our side with the Watergate incident. But we wanted to have something concrete that could institutionalize the relationship and keep it going, even if it got in difficulty. So I and another guy came up with the idea of a liaison office. It was perfect. Nobody knew what a liaison office was. There never had been one, so it had no clear implications. And we could say with a straight face to Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek, this doesn't have any implications at all for our relationship. But on the other hand, it would perform most of the functions of an embassy. As I say, I got to open it. We flew to Hong Kong. There was a group of 6. The last minute, somebody from CIA was added, the 7th guy. So when we got to Beijing, they put him at the 7th table in the 7th chair, just to make it clear they knew who he was. We got to Hong Kong, and in those days, there was no connection to the China mainland. So we had to carry our suitcases, walk over a railway bridge into Guangdong province in southern China. Went into Guangzhou, had a nice meal, got on an airplane to go to Beijing. Somewhere along the way, the airplane didn't go to Beijing, it just landed at an airport and the crew got off. And I asked the Chinese crew, why are we landing here? It was in Hefei, Anhui province. And they said, oh, well, the captain thinks the noodles in this airport are the best in the country. And he was hungry, so he stopped. This was a very different experience than the outside world. Got to Beijing, met by a couple of people I'd actually met during the Nixon trip, and moved into the Beijing hotel. We had a very senior communicator from the Department of State with us. It turned out he didn't know how to operate a one-time pad. That is a little machine that enables you to encrypt very slowly a text with a one-time code, which isn't easily breakable. So I ended up sitting in the bathtub during the whole time I was there with a plank and this machine on it, doing all of the communication for the group. Since nobody else in the group except the head of the delegation spoke Chinese, I also ended up doing everything else. I was counseling the U.S. Marines who arrived as guards, measuring curtains in their apartment, and talking to the only Chinese. We had one local employee who had been personally selected by Zhou Enlai for his abilities as a poet. We needed somebody to run the motor pool, not to write poetry. So I ended up running the motor pool also. And right in the middle of this, we had to get equipment in from Washington, and we got an airlift. The U.S. Air Force sent a whole bunch of transport planes, and I organized a bunch of Chinese, about 200 Chinese, in trucks to unload these things and move the cars and the office equipment and the furniture, the usual awful government furniture, into the space that we had. When I went out there, a guy from the Administrative Bureau of the Department of State got off the plane, and he said, come with me. I said, but I got to supervise this unloading. He said, no, you don't. You don't understand how we got this airlift. I said, how did you get the airlift? He said, we promised the White House that we would go to the Friendship store and buy a lot of jade grapes and other things. And he had a briefcase full of cash, a couple of $100,000. I've always thought this was where B.B. Reboso's donation ended up. So we went down to the Friendship store and bought up a storm, and I hired 11 taxis and took them back out and put all this stuff on the planes, and we were set up. Should mention one other thing. The Brazilians had been about to establish relations with China. The Chinese had built them a little embassy, and they offered it to us because the Brazilians, as is fairly typical of the Brazilians, had changed their mind. There wasn't enough space in there. So I went over with the admin counselor, a very bright, capable guy, to the Diplomatic Services Bureau, which services embassies in Beijing. And they said, well, what kind of building would you like? And I drew a building, the exterior of it and the interior plan, and gave it to them. And they said, okay. And 2 hours later, they gave us finished architectural drawings. They broke ground 2 hours after that. They worked 24 hours a day for 16 days and built what is now the cultural center for the United States in Beijing, adjacent to the ambassador's residence. So this was an experience that it really was unique. I saw a lot of Zhou Enlai because we would have problems and have to get them fixed. I made a problem myself when I noticed that in the newspapers, since it was the Cultural Revolution, no one identified themselves by name. So you'd see, Joe Smith, Prime Minister of Ireland, came and he met with responsible persons of the departments concerned. So I went to the printing press. We had to get stationery printed and so on, and I was negotiating that. And I got them to print me a bunch of cards that said in one side, responsible person of the department concerned, and on the other side, Yoguanbuman the Fuzoran, which is the same thing in Chinese. And I used to present this to people. And I could tell whether I would like them or not. If they laughed, I liked them. And if they scowled, I knew I wouldn't like them. It was a very, very active time and a moment in history to be savored. Finally, I went down to the Hong Kong border, the railroad bridge, and greeted David Bruce, who was the first head of the Liaison office, an extraordinarily distinguished former banker and diplomat, probably our most senior diplomat at that time, along with Ellsworth Bunker. I had lunch with Ellsworth Bunker when I came back from Beijing, and he asked me how his friend David Bruce was doing, and I said, fine, except he's a little old. And Ellsworth Bunker looked at me and said, I'm 10 years older than he. So overall, this was interesting. I came back and debriefed to all sorts of people on how the Chinese had made us welcome, what problems we'd had. One story. The Chinese were very proud in those days that they had no inflation, or so they claimed. So when we were negotiating the lease on our building, they had a clause in there that after 5 years they could adjust the lease to raise the price. And I said, I really don't understand how you can do that. You have no inflation in China. I've always admired that about you. I mean, it's unique. Why are you violating your ideology like this? They took it out. So we got the building forever at the same rate. That is the story of the opening of the Liaison office, or at least some key elements of it. It was in the spring of 1973. Finally, I was asked to stay there, either as political officer, econ officer, consular officer, or as admin officer. And I declined because China in those days, living in Beijing as a foreigner, was living under house arrest. And I said, I won't come back here until one of two things have happened. Either I've risen high enough in the Foreign Service so that I don't care, I will have contacts appropriate for me, or China has changed, whichever happens first. Both happened. And in 1981, I went back as the chargé at the embassy, newly opened.